We have an exclusive interview. Tom Groppel, former Director of Ceremonies and Special Events for the Military District of Washington and a Vietnam War veteran. He was the planner for the funerals for Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. He has also helped outline the funerals for Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. He also planned state visits to the White House, including St. John Paul II's visit in 1979. In this episode of Dive Deep, we travel to Jerseyville, Illinois, where Groppel resides. He first shares stories of that papal visit and why John Paul II was unlike any other person who visited, and stories from inside the White House, including his conversations with each of these 5 presidents and their funeral arrangements, including how Bill Clinton's chief of staff originally would not allow a presidential plane when Richard Nixon's wife died, and what changed his mind. Why was President Carter the eulogist for President Ford and not Ford's daughter? And where President Biden will have his funeral, and it's not the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington. If you love history and stories you've never heard before, this interview is for you. I'm Andrew Hansen, and this is Dive Deep. Let's first talk about John Paul II's visit during President Carter's tenure. What was your role in planning John Paul II's visit to come to the White House?
A head of government, head of state, normally arrives on the North Drive through the Northwest Gate and goes up to the portico. Standard package, doesn't change from visit to visit, so that was done. There was a lot of discussion in the Carter House about the appropriateness of a military formation on the South Lawn. Even though the Pope is, to a minor extent, has a military connection with the Swiss Guard, it doesn't quite relate to the same thing that I do on the South Lawn. And so I said, in one of the meetings inside the Carter administration, I was questioned about, was anybody going to get upset? I said, I don't think so. I said, I don't think anybody sees an identity with the military and Pope John Paul. I said, even though he's the head of state, technically he falls into a category. He's one of a kind. And I said, I don't think so.
Why was he one of a kind? Take us to that day when he arrived.
Well, heads of government, heads of state, either you're royalty or you're an elected official. To a lot of people, non-Catholics, the Pope doesn't fall in that category. He's not elected and he's not seen as royalty. But so he was one of a kind, and he wasn't young and spry. I don't know his age when he came to the White House, but he moved carefully, and in discussions leading up to his arrival, it was suggested that maybe a military formation is not the answer here, and that invited guests of the administration be on the South Lawn. A beautiful day. I was running late, and I don't recall why exactly, but he was the Pope was coming to us from Capitol Hill, and you could hear the sirens in the distance. I mean, everything stops on Pennsylvania Avenue, and my subordinates had everything all set on the North Lawn, and so forth. And Rex Scouten was Rex is now deceased, was the usher and for the White House, and the usher controls everything that happens inside the building. And Rex was just a nice guy. Nothing upset Rex. Well, Father Marchenko, who was the advanced clergy for the Pope, was in there, and he wanted to change things. And he sort of had him up in the corner and so forth, and I walked in, and Rex pointed, he says, he's the one that can change the ceremony. And Father Marchenko turned to me and he sort of made this outburst about things need to be more grand. I said, Father, we're not going to change one damn thing. I said, you agreed to everything we're doing? I said, you can hear the Pope in the distance. I said, I couldn't change anything if I wanted to. And he leveled me with 4-letter words. And I says, my, Father, you sure have a colorful vocabulary. And came in and he had a one-on-one with the Carters for some time. And then we went downstairs and went out and he was introduced to the audience.
Describe seeing the Pope and the other people seeing the Pope. I know you've said that in the past that he kind of had this aura about him, and people were really struck by him and his presence, almost more so than any other person who visited the White House, right?
Definitely. And I say this as a non-Catholic. He radiated. And President Carter, of the presidents I've been around, was probably the most comfortable with his faith and his beliefs and so forth. And he was even a little awestruck by the Pope. And the Pope, he had ugly hands. He had carpenter's hands, literally. And I don't use that in the religious sense. But short, stubby, and he always carried them in a very rested position in front of him. And he was, I used to give Father Marty's heard me share before, used to give the Secret Service a hard time. I said, don't ever assign a Catholic to protect the Pope. I said, they can't turn their back on him. They want to look at him. You know, they think it's disrespectful, I think. But no, but he was, I've never met another human that had that aura.
So Tom, you also took part in many ceremonials, burials at Arlington National Cemetery. You have kind of a funny story dealing with the Catholic Church in one of those instances. Tell us about that.
Going back to World War II, when the Germans invaded Poland, there was the head of the Polish government was a gentleman by the name of Paderewski. He went into exile. He went to Canada. He took the Polish government into exile, so not to be captured by the Germans. And I guess for health reasons, he came to the United States for medical help and so forth. He wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, asking that and explained what his background was, that I'm in poor health, and on the occasion of my death, would you allow my body to remain in the United States until my homeland's free, and then send me home? It makes no difference to President Roosevelt. I mean, he initials it and sends it over to defense. He says, take care of this. So we inherited Paderewski. He died. And I think he died in 45. And we had him under the Mass of the Main, which is a monument in Arlington Cemetery. And you could look through the little holes in the monument. And he was in there on a pair of sawhorses, his casket was. And, well, ironic enough, Poland and John Paul, Poland's free. And I hadn't had a rehearsal for a state funeral in a long time, and obviously I was having a slow day, and somehow I put my needs for a rehearsal and Paderewski in the same thought process. I says, I'll send Paderewski home. The Poles had forgotten we had him. Now, that was ancient history to them. And so I went to the State Department and put them between me and the Polish government. And I said, this is what I want to do. And the State Department says, fine with us, we'll notify the Poles. And so we brought Paderewski out of the Mass of the Main, brought him up on Fort Myer, and we had a church service. And obviously Catholic. Well, it just so happens that the chief of chaplains for the Army was a major general. He happened to be Catholic. And he and I were not good friends, but speaking acquaintances. So I went to him and told him what I was going to do. And I said, since he's Catholic, you're more than happy to participate. He said, love to. And so then I set about in the Catholic Church to find a Polish, the senior Pole in the Catholic Church. Well, he was a retired cardinal, I think out of New York. And he came down and he was going to officiate. And we did the rehearsal, and this retired cardinal, he had this major general, you'd think he was an altar boy. He had him running all over. And I kept, what in the world's going on here? Well, I got what I needed. I got the rehearsal I needed. And so we're done. Everybody's gone home. And I got the general aside. I said, sir, I think I owe you an apology. He says, why? I says, the old cardinal's got you run like an altar boy. I said, that's not, he said, Tom, he says, these 2 stars don't mean a thing to the Catholic Church.
So a big part of your role over the years was planning presidential funerals. So talk about that process. What does that entail? You obviously have to sit down with the president at some point and talk about his death, in a sense. What are the conversations like? What are some stories you remember over all the presidents that you served?
Well, the first one was my biggest challenge, President Nixon, because of the way he left office. And you just don't, when a man's in his 50s or 60s in apparently good health, you don't say, let's talk about your funeral. I mean, that's a hard subject to broach. Well, his departure happened to be the first time, or the first ceremony that only my fingerprints were on the ceremony. And the man who hired me, a guy by the name of Paul Miller, World War II vet, he and the Major General downstairs had decided I was going to be the heir apparent without talking to me. They just decided this on their own, that I was the logical choice. Paul wanted to retire. And so that hadn't taken place just yet, but I got this call from the White House, and I'd been in the office 9 months, and I had no chemistry with the guy on the other end of the phone. He and I, we just didn't have any chemistry at all. And he says, Groppel, he says, the president's going to resign tomorrow at noon. I want a ceremony on the South Lawn, and I need it over here in 2 hours with a diagram and sequence of events. Click. No questions. Didn't take any questions, no answers. So I walked across the hall. Well, Paul Miller had buried John Kennedy. And if Paul Miller told me once, he told me 100 times, he says, you don't want to do this in the middle of the night. Because when President Kennedy was assassinated, you couldn't find Kennedy and burial or funeral in a sentence or paragraph of anything. They just didn't expect it to happen. That wasn't something you planned on. So Paul Miller had taught me well. He said, you just don't want to do this in the middle of the night. So I went across the hallway and explained to him the phone call I just received. He leaned back in his chair. He says, well, what do you think that's going to look like? I said, sir, I'm looking for a little guidance. He says, he looked at his watch. He says, 2 hours. He said, you better get started on it. That was the guidance. So I made 5 trips across that hallway, and he would not take that piece of paper out of my hand. He'd lean forward and he said, what are you thinking about here? Why are you doing this? I go back and rearrange things. And so on the 5th trip across, he says, well, it's about time for you to clean it up and get it over to the White House. So that was my baptism. That was Mr. Nixon. Well, I tried for 10 years to talk to Richard Nixon. I would make, and his office was in New Jersey, and I would make 3 and 4 phone calls a year, and his secretary and I were on first name basis. I could never get the president, and I told her, this is what the topic is, and she said, well, if it comes up, I'll get back to you. So about the 10th year, she put me on hold. I said, well, I'm making progress. I've been put on hold. And she came back and she said, Tom, she said, how soon can you be here? I said, it's 2 o'clock tomorrow. She said, well, I've been working on my list of questions for 10 years. I've rewritten that 100 times. Of things that, well, this is not that important and this is more important and so forth. Well, Richard Nixon was probably of the presidents that I've had the good fortune to serve and know, was without a doubt the smartest. Short on personality, but long on brains. And when you walked into his office, he never had anything on his desk. There's not a book, not a pad, not a pad of paper, not a pencil, nothing on his desk. So I walked in there, and well, I've been working on my list of questions for 10 years. I mean, I've got mine well refined. Well, that's not why I was there. It was about her. No one knew she was ill. He says, Mr. Groppel, he says, the First Lady is ill. I'm not sure how long we're going to have her. And I want to give you some directions to how we're going to bury her. And it made perfect sense, well thought out, sequential, logical, and I'm just writing like crazy to capture everything he told me. Second thing, interesting thing about Richard Nixon was when the conversation's over, you knew it was over. You heard the click. I heard the click. This conversation's over. You just pick up your stuff and leave the room. And so Kathy says, well, how'd it go? You were in there for quite a while. I said, I don't know. It'll take me 2 days to get my notes figured out. And so I got them organized, realized what I didn't know yet and what I need to know in order to do the funeral. And I decided that I wanted to get a big airplane. Normally, caskets are carried down in luggage, in baggage, where the baggage is. I didn't want that to be the case. I want to take her up on the flight deck. And airplanes are not designed to take caskets up on flight decks. So you have to rearrange a few things in order to get through that back door. And so this was during the Clinton administration. Mr. Clinton's chief of staff was a guy named Erskine what's Erskine's last name? It'll come to me in a minute. But he was his chief of staff, young guy out of North Carolina. And so I called the military office and I said, I need an appointment with Mr. Clinton's chief of staff. He said, what's the topic? I said, it's personal. Former president. I didn't want to put any names out on the street. So they let me go see him. So I went into his office over in the West Wing, and he was working on his computer. I said, sir, I said, it's not common knowledge. I said, Mrs. Nixon is ill, and she may not live a year, and I want one of the executive flight airplanes to take her to California for burial. He didn't ask any questions, he said, no. Well, to say the least, I wasn't expecting a no. And I just sat there. I mean, that had not entered my head that was a possibility. And he stopped typing and turned around and says, I take it you don't like my answer. I said, sir, I said, with all due respect, it might be the dumbest thing I've heard today. And got up and walked out. And I was frustrated and confused and so forth. And by the time I walked from the West Wing to the East Wing, where the military office was, I thought, well, I'll be fired by the time I get over there. And nobody said a word. I just picked up my stuff and went home. And so there are lots of big airplanes out there, and there are lots of people who give you a big airplane, especially if you're doing a state funeral. And so I was pondering about how I was going to tackle the civilian side, and it wasn't the next day, I think it was 2 days later, I got a call from the military office. They said, the President's Chief of Staff is asking for you. What in the hell you got going on with him? I says, it's his meeting, ask him. So I went to see him, and he says, I take it from your response the other day, you didn't like my answer. I said, sir, I owe you an apology. I said, I was out of line, I should not have said that. I said, but your boss is going to be in the same position Mr. Nixon's going to be in someday. I said, your boss, President Clinton, is in a very small fraternity. And everybody gets to have comments about other people. And he says, okay, you can have your airplane. And I said, would you call the military office and tell them that I can have the airplane? I said, they won't take my word for it. And so he said, yep, I'll take care of it for you. So I went over there, and so the Air Force was very upset with me because I had gone around them. And so I didn't understand the history of the airplane, but the Air Force gave me one of the big Boeings out of the executive flight and said, that's going to be your airplane. Fine. So we got a casket and worked out the back door and so forth. She died about 10 months later up in New Jersey. We loaded her in New York. There's an Air Guard base up in New York. And we put her up the back steps. And just, it's a coincidence of how history repeats itself and so forth. Only the president was going to go up the front steps. And because the office and so forth up in the front of the airplane. And so he goes halfway up the steps and he stops. He has no reason to stop. And looks at the back of the airplane. I said, what? And they're all done at the back, and they're taking the steps away from the back of the airplane. I said, what in the world is he doing? Couldn't figure it out. So he goes on the airplane. I go up. We're on our way to California. Well, our telephones aren't what they are today. And so one of the stewards come back and says, Mr. Groppel, the president wants to talk to you. Well, the last thing I needed was an audible at 30,000 feet. And he says, Tom, he says, the first time he'd ever used my first name. He says, Tom, he said, I want to thank you for this airplane. I says, sir, this airplane belongs to Mr. Clinton. No, he said, this airplane. I said, sir, I said, I don't understand what you're telling me or what you're asking me. He says, this is the airplane I took into China. And he was reading the tail number off the airplane. It was 26,000. That was the 707 that he took to China when he opened up China when he was president. Now, it was no longer Air Force One. It had gotten down in the fleet. But that's how that man's mind worked.
When you meet with presidents, you've served for so many, what are the processes you go through with them? What are some of those questions you ask them that you then prepare for when it comes to their funeral? Because you've done a lot of their funerals. Generally, across the board, there's a great deal of modesty. Great modesty. President Ford and I, every conversation we ever had one-on-one, he said, Tom, I wasn't elected. And I would say, sir, I don't give a damn that you weren't elected. You were president of the United States, and I'm going to bury you as the president of the United States. But he was so modest, and again, on the religious side, the hardest question I ever asked him was, who would you like to have as eulogist? We discussed that for 4 years. And every time he'd come up with a new name. One time he came up with Susan, his daughter.
I said, sir, have you discussed this with Susan? No, but he said, you could explain it better than I could. And so I ended up the job of asking Susan if she would eulogize her father. So I didn't want to do that on the telephone. So she lives in Oklahoma City. So I called her up. She knew who I was. And I said, I just had a conversation with your father, and you and I need to talk about a few things. So I went to Oklahoma City, and over a cup of coffee in her kitchen, she says, absolutely not. I could no more eulogize my father than the man in the moon. You know, I'm his little girl. And I said, okay. I said, I'm not the least bit surprised. So, and then one time one meeting, he came up with an Episcopal priest in New Jersey. I had never heard this name. I've never heard anybody in New Jersey, and I couldn't put New Jersey and Ford in the same sentence or paragraph. And I said, sir, I says, you send this guy a Christmas card? No. I said, and you want him to eulogize you? And you don't share Christmas cards? I said, sir, I said, I don't think this'll fly. And as history will give you some quirky answers, he and President Carter met at a funeral, and I don't know what funeral they were at, but there was some common ground there, and they got to talking, and President Ford brought it up. President Carter was President Ford's eulogist. President Carter, a man of great faith, wove into when we had the Camp David Accords with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, and they made a movie, a play and a movie out of Camp David. The story is told about it had pretty well fallen apart, and President Carter just couldn't get him to talk. And Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, had said, I'm going home tomorrow. And he'd left and gone to his room. And I guess Menachem Begin started citing scripture to President Carter, and that was the wrong thing to do. He knew his scripture better than Menachem Begin probably did. And so they got an answer. But President Carter, when I talked to he and the missus, they were very easy to deal with. We couldn't agree. There's only one thing they couldn't agree on, and that was the burial site. She wanted, because the government now owns their house and the grounds around their house, and they had two different opinions of where the burial site was. So I was down there visiting with the Secret Service detail had changed leadership, and I was bringing the current leadership up to speed, because President Carter, when he traveled, he didn't travel nice places. He traveled third world countries in Africa. And I told the detail leader, I says, you guys don't go to nice places. I said, I need 5,000 feet of straight road. He says, what the hell are you talking about? I says, you don't have runway. I said, I need a way to get you out of there. If you have a health problem, I need to be able to get to you. And every time he would go to Africa, I would call Europe, and we'd put a C-130 on ramp alert, and that airplane sat there until he came home, just to go retrieve him. And so we were well along in the planning, and we were going to First Baptist Church, the biggest Baptist church up on 16th Street in the District of Columbia. Well, he had occasion to go to a funeral at the National Cathedral, Episcopalian. And I went down to visit him, just to update on certain things. He says, Tom, he says, how difficult would it be to move my funeral to the National Cathedral? I said, sir, I said, we're not going to the Baptist church anymore? Well, it's pretty impressive. I said, oh, it's very impressive. It's, yes. He says, I'd really like for you to look into that. Holy cow. I mean, that's sort of put a mountain in my path. And so I thought about it, called all my chaplains in, I mean, especially the Baptist and Episcopalian. I said, what common ground do you guys have? I mean, after the Bible, not much. And so the Episcopalian came back to me about 6 months later. He says, you may have got a break. They're going to put a new bishop up in the next cathedral, and he's coming out of San Diego, and he's been working with the Navy. So he understands the military, and you know, our challenge is going to be getting him one-on-one with you, because they just don't let the bishop wander out one-on-one. So we finally arranged it that I got a one-on-one with him, and I told him exactly what my issue was. He says, well, he says, that's quite a request you're asking of me. And I says, well, I've been schooled a little bit by your clergy. I said, this is what I like, because in an Episcopal church, they take the flag off and put a pall on the casket. I says, I don't want to do that. I don't want to put the pall on. I'll let you receive at the door, as is your custom, with altar boys. Do your blessings at the door. Process into the church. We'll go up on the altar. You can give words of welcome. And then, because the Baptists don't sing anything out of your hymnals. What a Friend We Have in Jesus is not an Episcopal hymnal. So I'll print my own program and so forth. And he agreed to it. And that's why you're seeing what you're seeing today, because that was agreed to, and now every state funeral is going to go to National Cathedral.
What about President Reagan? Any President Reagan stories?
President Reagan was a nice guy, terribly nice guy. I don't think he knows any four-letter words. Very doesn't have the intellect of a Clinton. We were back up just a little bit before his funeral service. After he'd gotten shot, I was told change the arrival ceremony on South Lawn because of his injuries. And so I took the steps off this thing. I took the inspection out. So all I had to do was walk out, make remarks, and walk back. So all the inspection was taken out of the ceremony. And I was told, and you're not to discuss this. Fine, okay. So we go for about 2 years, and I always make the comment about President Reagan. He couldn't find a rainy day to save his soul. Every time he had a ceremony, had beautiful weather. I never got rained on with President Reagan. And so we're 2 years down the road, and each president takes his briefing a little bit differently. He took his probably 2 days in advance. President Clinton took his 10 minutes in advance. You talked to him 10 minutes before he walked out the door. And so I went over and we talked about it, and he says, Tom, he says, when are we going to put the inspection back in? I said, whenever you think you're ready, sir. Boy, 3 guys got up. When I left the room, they followed. I said, he brought it up. I didn't bring it up. You know, I said, I'm clean on this one. Okay, get out of here. But so I kept asking myself in the dealings with the Reagans, even after they left, he wanted to go to this one church out in Hollywood Hills, and
for his funeral.
For his funeral.
Okay.
And the pastor had a little bit of a bad boy reputation, and I brought that up. I said, "Sir, I says, do we really want to go here?" And so that was changed. He and the missus thought about that, and then they'd make some minor changes, and that was fine. They were out of office, and his mental illness was starting to show up. And whenever I talked to him in their dining room, they had a long dining room table. It was probably 15 feet from one end to the other. She'd sit at one end, he'd sit at the other end. I'm in the middle. So if I turned to talk to him and bring him along in the conversation, so I got him thinking about it and so forth, and then she'd say something to interrupt me, I lost him. I have to go back and get him. So the last time I saw him before he died, on the airplane out there, I kept saying to myself, there's something I don't know. There's something I don't know here. And I just kept hounding myself. And it was his children. He had some interesting children. And they had some interesting children. Not without an opinion. And so I went to see him down in his office down in Hollywood. And I walked in, I said, sir, I says, just in case you or the missus are infirmed when you get terminal, who do I need to talk to? Didn't even hesitate. He came up with a name I'd never heard. I said, sir, who is that? He said, oh, he's one of my best friends. I said, really? I said, can you give me that in writing? He said, why would you need that? He says, I just told you. I said, I'm not sure your children would understand that. I said, could you give me a letter to that effect and have it notarized? He says, oh, absolutely. So I got a notarized letter.
What about President George H.W. Bush? What do you remember about your conversation with him about his funeral and the planning behind that?
He chased me all over the country trying to figure out where. We went to Maine. First I was going to Kennebunkport, and then decided, no, that you don't want to have a grave at the house. And so then he said, then the local cemetery and so forth. And I was up visiting him, and it was all the local people there in Kennebunkport. They had a monthly cemetery meeting. He said, Tom, he says, I think you need to go to that meeting. I said, sir? I said, this is sort of your thing. He said, yeah. He said, but you know the details better than I do. So I went, explained what would happen, and I'd gone to the cemetery and I'd looked at it. Well, the front of the cemetery is all filled up, so they're working a quarter mile back. And so his grave wasn't going to be just one of the normal headstone. And so I laid it out for him, and I says, and you're probably going to have a lot of traffic in your cemetery for 5 to 10 years. They weren't so sure they wanted that. And they didn't say no, but they made it clear that they weren't wild about the idea. So I reported accurately back. So we went to Rice University in Houston, went to another place in Houston, and he hadn't decided where his library was going to be yet. And we finally got part of the land from Texas A&M, which is a land grant school. His library is now in what used to be the dairy pasture. So they gave him 60 acres out of A&M for his library. And that answered all the questions. So he, the missus, and their infant daughter that died in infancy, that they always talk about. And he says, and tell my kids, this is not a family plot. The missus and I and our daughter. I said, sir, I said, that'd be best coming from you. He took that on. But he's such an interesting guy in the fact that they hired a firm in Houston to design his headstone. And I talked to the guy, the engineer who was doing the design, and I says, the key here to selling your design is modesty. I said, it can be big, but it's got to be modest. And I said, and I don't know exactly how to define it any better for an architect. And so he called me about a month or so later. He says, let me run something by you. So he faxed it to me. I said, it'll never fly. I said, it's beautiful. I said, I'd take it in a heartbeat. I said, but I don't think President Bush will like it. He said, oh, come on. And I said, I'm just telling you, I don't think you'll sell it. And he called me 2 days later and said, you're right. I didn't sell it. So he redesigned it.
Have you already met then with President Trump, President Biden,
No.
President Obama? None of those yet?
Biden's aren't talking to anybody. Well, I'll take that back.
Okay.
By secondhand, I got some feedback that Mr. Biden, being Catholic, he wants to go to St. Matthew's. He doesn't want to go to the new church out by Catholic University, which is much more gracious and big and seating capacity and so forth. He sort of hung up on the John Kennedy mentality of St. Matthew's downtown, and it's a terrible place to do a funeral. I mean, sidewalks are 6 feet wide, and you close down that part of the District of Columbia when you have a funeral there.
Your boss did the funeral of John F. Kennedy, obviously a Catholic. You weren't working there at the time, but what did your boss tell you about that experience of having to deal with an assassination and a quick funeral, also the Catholic funeral rites as you eventually came on board at the White House?
Well, I think the secret to success of the Kennedy funeral was Paul Miller, my predecessor, was a great historian, and the sitting president that he was, the White House is now your home. So we use the East Room as for the catafalque, and the catafalque we use is the Lincoln catafalque that was used by President Lincoln up at Capitol Hill. We just transported it down, and it has its own little room down underneath the rotunda, and we bring it down to the White House, and because he's a resident of the White House as the sitting president, he lies in state in the East Room. And it was, Paul Miller talked me through it well. He says, but again, when he was assassinated, you couldn't find one bit of print that had Kennedy and funeral in it. I mean, nobody expected a 45-year-old man to be assassinated. No, just totally unexpected.
Looking back on your career and all these state funerals and heads of state coming to visit the White House, what was the most challenging? When you think of all your stories, what were some of the most challenging moments of your career?
My biggest mistake, I played the wrong music one time. It happened to be President Carter. It happened to be the President of Romania. And we have among the military, the premier military band, we have a very elaborate system where the librarians talk constantly, so they all agree on what's the right music. And because you have copyright and so forth, and it's much more complicated than most people realize. And so they went through the normal system. That day we used the Marine Band, and I have a picture of me talking to the drum major. And the Marine Band's the only band at the time that marched without an officer. They marched just with the drum major. And a terribly good musician. And so we're doing the arrival ceremony on South Lawn, doing the anthem. The guy from State Department slips up next to me, says, Groppel. He says, the Romanians say you're playing the wrong anthem. I took two steps to my left to where my boss was standing. I said, "Sir, it's the State Department telling me we're playing the wrong anthem." He's gone. And I didn't see him for half a day. To this day, I don't know where Paul Miller went. And so no one else knew that. And so ceremony's over. All the official party and the Carters go inside. I went over and there's a picture taken of me and I'm right in his face because I didn't want anybody to hear what I was telling him. I said, "You're to go home. I need a memorandum for record on my desk by noon. Tell me exactly how in the hell we got here. Everybody you talked to, everybody who agreed that we were playing the right anthem, so forth and so on." He says, "I understand." Went back, sent the troops home. And Romanians realized what they had done in the fact that they had changed their anthem one day prior to leaving Romania. A copy of the new anthem was in a briefcase on the South Lawn. They had just gotten off the airplane that morning. So they give us the new music. And so we took and wrote it for orchestra, or arranged it for orchestra. It was arranged for band. And we went to President Carter and told him what we'd done. He said, "I can't find fault with anything you've done."
You played the right anthem in the
end. You were ignorantly ignorant. And so we arranged for orchestra, and that night when they came for the state dinner, when they walked in the North Portico, the Marine Band, they had the new arrangement, and they played the new anthem. He said, "We can play both ways."
Now, you've had the privilege of serving so many presidents over all these decades. You've served our country. Thank you again for your service. What's been the most memorable thing in your career, in your life? I mean, so many Americans would pinch themselves just to shake hands with the president. You're having intimate conversations with them, and you get to know their family. What are some of the biggest memorable conversations or just things that you got to do over all those decades?
They're very human. They all have a very human side to them. For all the aura we put around them and so forth. Just a couple examples. The Carter State funeral. We were down, we had everything done. I had Nash Cathedral lined up, had Nash Cathedral done. I learned more about Paschal candles than I ever wanted to know. And the church sent me a bill for the Paschal candle, so I paid for it. And but the Carters couldn't agree on where they wanted to be buried at the house. I said, "Sir," it makes no difference to me. When we take you from Georgia to Washington, you got to tell me. Somebody got to point to a place, A or B. I don't care, but I need to tell my people A or B. And so I think I shared with you earlier in the conversation, I was down talking to the detail leader, and President Carter had a workshop in his garage. That garage hadn't seen a car in 20 years. And he heard that I was on the compound. He says, "When Tom's done talking to you guys, send him over. I'm going to talk to him." So I went over, and he said, "Let's go for a walk." Okay. We're walking along. He says, "About this issue that the missus and I got." I said, "Sir," I said, "I'm not going to get into that." I said, "I've told you my requirements." He said, "No, but seriously," he said, "you got to have a thought on it." And it's probably the smartest thing I've ever said. I said, "Sir, I think whoever dies first wins. The survivor will feel so guilty they'll let the person who dies first have their way." And he started laughing. He said, "I think you're right." And that's what happened.
Wow.
Miss Lillian, or Mrs. Carter, got her way.
Got her way. How do you think us as a culture, we should be honoring the dead, and how we should, give those people who passed away the utmost respect in a service and the burial. What would be like your advice to us, not only Catholics, but our country, on how we can better honor our dead?
I think I got there accidentally when the Reagan administration decided we're going to bury a Vietnam unknown. Secretary Weinberger, Caspar Weinberger, was Secretary of Defense then, and nice guy. He had been an intel officer in the South Pacific for MacArthur. And I understand from everything I read about General MacArthur, he was a hard man to work for. Just terribly, terribly demanding. So Secretary Weinberg was just a prince of a guy. Nothing could get him excited and so forth, and just sort of give you a little insight into him. They would never let anybody in to see the secretary by himself. The last thing they wanted was somebody to come out and say, well, the secretary told me thus and so. And you could wreak all kinds of havoc with that statement. And so I had achieved the privilege of one-on-one. So they said, okay, you need to talk to the boss about ceremonies, go talk to him. And I'd go one-on-one with him. General Powell, as a young brigadier general, was his doorkeeper. And he's later to become a 4-star general and Secretary of State. And General Powell was just totally unflappable. Nothing. The only thing that I ever saw that upset General Powell was a black Air Force colonel came in and made some black comment to General Powell. And Powell was out of his desk and grabbed that guy by the arm, took him out, and he says, don't you ever come in this office and do that again. But General Powell called me one day. He says, Groppel, he says, I need you and your boss over here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I said, what's the topic, sir? He said, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Click. Okay, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So I went in, walked across the hall. I said, sir, it's just talking to Paul Miller. I was still in uniform. I said, Secretary of Defense wants to see you and I tomorrow morning. He said, what's the topic? I said, don't know. Reagan administration. So we went over there, 8 o'clock, walked in, just Secretary Weinberger, Paul Miller, myself, and General Powell. He says, Secretary Weinberger dealt daily with me, but he knew who Paul was. And he says, Paul, he says, the President decided we're going to bury a Vietnam unknown. I want you and Tom to plan it. You're to share that statement with no one until the White House comes public with it. You're to do all your planning, and no one's to know what you're doing. And well, that's quite a challenge in itself. And Paul turned to me and says, can we do this? I said, sir, we can't do it with 2 of us. We need at least one more. He said, you can have one more. Same ground rules. He says, I'll transfer money to your command's account, and they transferred $2 million. And he says, I'll call your boss and tell him it's for your use only, and when it's time, he'll be told what you're doing. So we set about planning the Vietnam unknown, and that's probably the most challenging. It was good to make the services think outside the box, outside their comfort level. Like in Hawaii, where we started the funeral process with the selection. I outlined how we was going to do that. And the deputy sink pack, that's a 4-star deputy, was a Marine, and he says, and I said, we're wearing choker whites. Choker whites is the Navy Marine uniform that buttons right across the throat. He said, this is Hawaii. He said, we don't wear choker whites in Hawaii. I said, sir, you don't have state funerals in Hawaii either. I said, we're going choker whites. We're not going casual here. You know, open collar and short sleeve shirts. I said, okay, point made. And I said, and I want that, and I wanted a ship that had gun barrels on it. I don't want a cargo ship or anything. I said, I want something that looks combatant. I said, and I want you to back it into that. He said, we don't back ships in, we come to bow in. I said, sir, he said, I know, state funeral. We'll back it in because I wanted to use that as my stage. So when I took the casket up on the back of the ship and so forth. But that was probably the most challenging because you had a captive audience. I mean, they were uncluttered with previous knowledge.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today and these incredible stories. Thank you for your service to our country. It was a great conversation, some really interesting tidbits, and we appreciate your time.
Quite welcome.